No one expected the truth about Gaza to come from Burkina Faso. Not the United Nations, not the White House, but a small West African nation that had no oil, no missiles, no seat at the G7 table, just a spine and a soul. While the world turned away, while the powerful drowned in press releases and policy speeches, a small group of Palestinians crossed forests, deserts, oceans, carrying not weapons, not money, but a final thread of hope. They arrived at the gates of the presidential palace in Ouagadougou. They didn't ask for asylum. They didn't ask for money. They asked to speak, to tell the story of silent deaths, of starving children surrounded by rotting aid, of a promise made by T.r.u.mp, the man who once declared Gaza will never be abandoned, then vanished when the bombs began. President Ibrahim, unknown to global headlines, uninvited to elite summits, sat down, no press, no cameras, just listening. And then he stood, not to issue denials, not to deploy police, but to deliver a sentence that shook global politics. If Burkina Faso can feed the starving without a war chest, then T.r.u.mp has no excuse to remain silent while death reigns. A statement, a convoy, a buried truth, unleashed. This is no longer a story about aid. This is a reckoning. From a nation not drawn into war games, but drawn by conscience, the one thing the world has forgotten. They sat in a circle, no microphones, no formal agenda, just 5 people from Gaza, 2 women, 3 men sharing pieces of a nightmare that had no cameras. One of them, Amina, couldn't stop trembling. She held up a plastic bracelet once worn by her son, Adam, age 4. "We queued for food," she said. "They dropped leaflets telling us to gather at the aid zone. We thought we'd finally eat. Instead, they shot at us." President Ibrahim said nothing. His jaw clenched. His fingers twitched, not from shock, but from recognition. He had heard similar stories before, from war zones in Mali, from rebel-ravaged villages in Niger. But this was something else. This was a betrayal disguised as salvation. Another man, Khalid, showed photos on a cracked phone, crates labeled T.r.u.mp humanitarian shipment, flour inside rotten, rice molded. But the cameras only filmed the delivery, he said bitterly. No one stayed to see what was inside. They spoke for 3 hours, they cried. They didn't ask for pity. And when they finished, Ibrahim asked one question. What happened to the T.r.u.mp promised silence? Until Amina whispered, "It was a show, for them, not for us." That night, Ibrahim didn't sleep. He went to the National Crisis Room, normally reserved for floods or internal displacements. He placed Gaza on the map. His ministers stared. "You want to send aid there across continents, in wartime, yes," Ibrahim said. "With what army? Not an army, with food." He ordered the Ministry of Foreign Affairs to initiate contact with NGOs operating underground routes. He called on Burkina Faso's modest stockpiles of rice pulses, clean water tablets, and emergency medical kits. The budget was tight. Fuel was scarce, but the order was clear. Make it happen. Quietly, swiftly. By dawn, the first convoy was being prepared. Then he wrote a letter not to T.r.u.mp, but to the African Union, the Arab League, and the UN General Assembly. The title was short, brutal. Where was T.r.u.mp when Gaza starved? The letter accused the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, a project spearheaded by T.r.u.mp.'s administration, of misleading the global public. It cited whistleblower reports, expired aid, the presence of armed contractors at food sites, and worst of all, a deliberate strategy of delayed aid to test civil resistance. Within 48 hours, the letter leaked. The backlash was immediate. T.r.u.mp.'s press office called the accusations malicious fabrications. State-aligned media painted Ibrahim as a theatrical populist seeking relevance. But the images, the testimonials, the bracelet, they said otherwise. And as social media lit up, a new name began trending. Ibrahim is our voice. From Ramallah to Accra, from Cape Town to Paris, people began asking, why did it take a West African nation to say what the powerful wouldn't? In response, Trump doubled down. He tweeted a cryptic phrase, "Small nations bark the loudest when they're hungry for attention." Ibrahim, in return, stepped onto the podium of the African Union Summit. His voice was calm, but each word carved like a blade. Burkina Faso does not bark. We feed, we listen, and we act when others rehearse sympathy in front of cameras. The hall erupted in applause. A day later, the first aid convoy from Burkina Faso reached a Gaza border tunnel. Local volunteers unloaded it in silence. Inside the packages was a single note written by Ibrahim's hand. "To those the world has abandoned, know this one heart still hears you." He didn't do it for votes. He didn't do it for headlines. He did it because the world needed to remember. Conscience is not a luxury. It is a duty. And that made him dangerous. Before Ibrahim's convoy crossed a single border, there had already been a promise. It was made by a man whose voice echoed across podiums, screens, and summit stages. Trump, the self-styled savior of the Middle East, stood before the cameras a year prior, flanked by flags and smiling diplomats. "We will not let Gaza fall into despair," he said. "My administration is committed to immediate humanitarian assistance, peace and prosperity in the region." The applause was thunderous. The headlines were obedient. The world once again believed. But the people of Gaza, those who lined up at dawn for a loaf of bread, those who wrapped their children in wet sheets to fight off fever, soon discovered what that promise really meant: nothing. Behind the scenes, the so-called Gaza Humanitarian Foundation began operation. It was touted as an independent relief mechanism backed by Trump's administration and several aligned donors. But something was off from the start. First, there were the images: soldiers, not aid workers, guarding supply trucks, helicopters hovering overhead, drones circling above queues of hungry people. Then came the supplies themselves: crates of flour with broken seals, rice crawling with weevils, boxes marked nutritional support containing only canned sodas and expired candy bars. Journalists were denied access. Aid workers were gagged by NDAs. Yet slowly cracks appeared in the narrative. A leaked memo from a subcontractor revealed that less than 12% of the total aid budget had reached Palestinian civilians. The rest, administrative expenses, logistics, security, and regional stabilization operations, a euphemism for military hardware. Whistleblowers began to emerge. One American security contractor assigned to the aid project wrote anonymously, "I thought I was part of a relief effort. Instead, I was helping manage crowd control at food sites we knew were going to get swarmed while snipers waited nearby." It wasn't just mismanagement. It wasn't just incompetence. It was theater-staged aid for international press, followed by starvation in real time. Meanwhile, Trump continued to tour capitals, signing trade deals, shaking hands, and collecting praise for his bold vision for peace. When questioned, he responded with sound bites. "We're doing more than anyone else. Aid is complicated. War zones are unpredictable. We're making progress." But progress for whom? For Ibrahim, the lie was personal. When he confronted Trump's delegation during a multilateral trade forum, they smiled. "President Ibrahim, we respect your passion, but this situation is delicate. Delicate. What's delicate about rotting flour? What's delicate about a child drinking puddle water because no aid worker dared cross a checkpoint?" Ibrahim didn't raise his voice. He didn't storm out. Instead, he returned to Burkina Faso and told his media office one thing: "We will say what they fear to hear." And so his speech before the United Nations was not a request. It was a reckoning. He listed names, dates, contracts, shipments. He showed receipts literally of aid packages that were never delivered, warehouses left empty, and villages marked as supplied, but where no truck had ever arrived. He read out the names of 10 Palestinian children who died of dehydration in June. "These are not numbers," he said, "they are indictments." He quoted Trump's own words. Then he tore them apart. "If a man speaks of mercy but funds bullets, he is not a peacemaker. He is a manufacturer of graves." The hall was dead silent. Some diplomats shifted in their seats. Others looked away. But the words were out. They could not be unsaid. Within days, the backlash against Trump intensified. Investigations were reopened. Protesters gathered outside embassies. Aid organizations demanded transparency. Social media exploded with new tags. Trump lied. Ibrahim exposed. Trump, of course, retaliated. He labeled Ibrahim a fringe populist, and Burkina Faso an irrelevant player trying to punch above its weight. But behind the curtain, his team scrambled. Several contracts tied to the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation were quietly suspended. A few middle managers resigned for personal reasons. And most tellingly, the silence from Western allies began to grow. They knew. They had always known. But now someone had spoken too loudly to be ignored, and it wasn't just the aid. Ibrahim revealed something even more damning intent. In one passage of his UN address, he quoted a leaked briefing between defense contractors and Trump's regional advisors. Prolonged instability reduces organized resistance. Starvation is an effective de-escalation mechanism. That was not humanitarian strategy. That was policy warfare. And suddenly the mask of goodwill fell. For decades, world leaders had cloaked inaction behind diplomacy. Ibrahim had torn that curtain open and pointed straight at the man behind it. And the world for a fleeting moment looked up. Not at a superpower, not at a press conference, but at a president from West Africa who had nothing to gain and everything to say. He didn't ask for applause. He didn't seek revenge. He simply asked the one question Trump could never answer. When you promised to help Gaza, did you ever mean to keep it? They called it the speech that broke the silence. Ibrahim's address to the United Nations was only 17 minutes long, but in that span of time it shattered months of spin-silenced talking heads and exposed a humanitarian theater the world had reluctantly accepted. The immediate reaction was disbelief. Then came outrage, and then something far more dangerous to Trump's empire momentum. Social media lit up in languages from every corner of the globe. Burkina truth. Gaza deserves better. Far food, not bullets. The footage of Ibrahim holding up a child's name tag from Gaza went viral. Amina's bracelet, once a forgotten artifact of tragedy, became a symbol of global guilt. News outlets that had once parroted the aid success narrative now began asking questions. CNN aired a special What Really Happened in Gaza. The BBC launched an investigation. Al Jazeera went further, interviewing volunteers on the ground who confirmed everything Ibrahim had said and more. One journalist in Ramallah said it best: the truth didn't come from Washington. It came from Ouagadougou. Meanwhile, in Gaza, the streets spoke louder than any broadcast. Children ran beside aid trucks bearing the Burkina Faso flag. In Rafah, a mural of Ibrahim's face was painted on a crumbled wall. Beneath it, the words, "He remembered us." But the consequences were not just emotional, they were geopolitical. Several African nations began pulling support from Trump-backed aid coalitions. South Africa called for a global review of all aid operations tied to Trump's foundation. Kenya proposed a new transparent coalition for humanitarian integrity, naming Ibrahim as honorary chair. In Europe, things turned turbulent. While some governments scrambled to stay neutral, parliaments in Ireland, Norway and Spain demanded sanctions against firms tied to the mismanaged aid network. Protesters surrounded embassies with signs, "Starving is not foreign policy. We believed your promises. Now we bury your lies." At home, Trump faced rising heat. His administration tried to deflect. He gave interviews. He doubled down. Burkina Faso is a microstate. Their president is chasing relevance. But the world wasn't listening anymore. They were watching the footage Ibrahim released of empty aid containers of decoy trucks, meant only for press events, of security contractors laughing as drones flew overhead. And then came the breaking point. An internal memo leaked to international press showed that the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation had falsified delivery records. Villages listed as fully supplied hadn't seen food in over 6 weeks. In several cases, the coordinates matched military installations, not refugee camps. Even longtime allies of T.r.u.mp could no longer cover. The Netherlands suspended donations. Canada demanded a full audit. The African Union issued a statement calling for a new ethical model of humanitarian assistance. And in the midst of it all, Ibrahim remained silent. He gave no victory speech, no second address. Instead, he focused on scaling up operations. Burkina Faso tripled its aid convoys. With support from independent NGOs and diaspora communities, it established safe tunnels for delivery routes, coordinated in secret, announced only through encrypted apps, used by volunteers on the ground. At the UN, when asked about his silence, Ibrahim simply said, "My words are already working. Now my people work." In a world addicted to image, he had chosen action. Meanwhile, T.r.u.mp tried to shift strategy. He launched a new campaign, Real Relief, Real Results. His team produced polished videos of food drops, smiling workers waving children. But it was too late. The trust was broken. The illusion had cracked. And one man armed with facts, dignity, and no interest in power had proved that truth travels faster than propaganda. Perhaps the most telling moment came during a global youth summit in Geneva. A student from Beirut stood up and asked the panel, "If President Ibrahim can act, why can't yours?" The room went silent, and then came applause. In just weeks, Ibrahim's stance had evolved from isolated defiance into a movement, one not about politics but principle, about remembering that aid is not a tool of leverage, but a test of humanity. And every time a convoy reached a starving village, every time a name like Amina's was remembered, that principle lived on. Not in ivory towers, not in declarations, but in the hands that carried food through fire. And somewhere in Gaza, a boy picked up a package that read, "With love from Burkina Faso." He looked up at his mother and asked, "Is Ibrahim real?" She smiled. "He's more real than most of the world." It had been 3 months since Ibrahim's speech shattered the silence. In the time since the world had not returned to normal, something had shifted permanently. Across continents, in the corridors of power, and on the streets of forgotten towns, people were no longer whispering. They were asking, demanding, remembering. And always one name returned: Ibrahim. His critics had expected the momentum to fade like a trending hashtag, or a diplomatic controversy swept under another scandal. But this wasn't a viral moment. This was a rupture, a reckoning. The hunger in Gaza still remained, the war had not ended, and the international power games continued. But now every press release was met with scrutiny, every promise measured against Ibrahim's question, "Did you ever mean to keep it?" In Burkina Faso, his approval ratings soared, not because of nationalism, but because of moral clarity. For the first time in decades, a small African state had taken the lead in a global crisis and stood its ground. Universities across the continent began teaching a new course, Ethics in Foreign Policy, the Ibrahim Doctrine. The core lesson was simple: aid is not charity, it is responsibility, especially when that aid was once withheld, weaponized, or sold as PR. Young diplomats in Ghana, Tunisia, Colombia, and the Philippines began quoting Ibrahim in debate chambers, not out of fandom, but because he had changed the standard. Leadership was no longer about presence, it was about conscience. But Ibrahim himself refused the pedestal. He declined a Nobel Peace Prize nomination. He turned down interview offers from every major network. When asked why, he simply said, "It's not about me. It's about who was forgotten. Don't turn their story into my spotlight." Instead, he redirected media attention to rebuilding clinics in Gaza, repairing damaged wells, and ensuring the convoys continued unbranded, untelevised, but real. Still, the world remembered. At the G20 summit, a journalist asked a pointed question to a Western leader. "Do you think Ibrahim has embarrassed you?" The leader paused, then said, "No. He reminded us who we're supposed to be." But not everyone was ready to be reminded. In certain capitals, discussions of Ibrahim's actions triggered discomfort. Think tanks labeled him unpredictable. Intelligence briefings called his influence disruptive. In private, some allies of T.r.u.mp referred to him as the conscience problem. And yet in the hearts of millions, he had become something greater than a president. He had become proof. Proof that power was not required to speak the truth. Proof that humanity could exist outside wealth borders and alliances. Proof that silence, no matter how strategic, was still complicity. One day a package arrived at the presidential office in Ouagadougou. Inside was a letter from a teenage girl in Gaza. Her name was Yasmin. She had survived an airstrike, lost both parents, and lived in a camp where Ibrahim's convoy had arrived weeks before. The letter was short. "President Ibrahim, I don't know what Burkina Faso is. I didn't even know Africa had presidents who cared about us, but I ate bread because of you, and I saw my baby brother smile because we got clean water. I know you'll never visit here. I know you're not doing this for us to love you, but I love you anyway. Thank you for not forgetting us. Yasmin, 14. The letter was framed not in the National Museum, but on the wall of the logistics center, where Ibrahim's volunteers gathered before each convoy. When Ibrahim saw it, he didn't speak. He just nodded, and went back to work. Because for him, legacy was not measured in monuments or medals. It was measured in bread, in water, in truth. And in a world drowning in spin, he had dared to be still and to speak. Meanwhile, T.r.u.mp faded. The investigations against his foundation intensified. Several former advisors were subpoenaed. One major donor cut ties. The phrase T.r.u.mp standard became a political insult. And slowly, inevitably, his empire of illusion crumbled not from attack, but from exposure. Because once someone sees the truth, they cannot unsee it. The world had been shown the truth by a president from a nation most maps didn't even highlight. And now the question remained, not for Ibrahim, not for T.r.u.mp, but for everyone watching. When history asks where you stood, what will you say? With the powerful who traded suffering for strategy, or with the quiet man who chose to act when the world chose silence? In an era when global politics is often driven by economic interests, media spectacles, and performative diplomacy, the story of President Ibrahim Traoré and his nation's quiet intervention in Gaza offers a radical lesson in what leadership truly means. It is not a story of power, wealth, or international leverage, but of conscience, courage, and clarity. From the forgotten heart of West Africa came a decision that challenged the powerful, comforted the powerless, and forced the world to ask an uncomfortable question: what does it mean to care? The most profound lesson from this story is that moral authority does not require military strength, financial dominance, or elite recognition. Burkina Faso, a landlocked country without oil reserves, nuclear capabilities, or a seat at the G7, showed that dignity is not measured by GDP, but by the choices a nation makes when no one is watching. When Palestinians arrived at the gates of the presidential palace, they did not ask for aid, they asked to be heard. And Traoré, unlike most world leaders, listened. That moment of listening without cameras, without policy advisors, without press releases, became the first revolutionary act. In a world trained to filter tragedy through spin, Ibrahim's willingness to bear witness disrupted the choreography of global apathy. He heard a mother speak of a child shot while waiting for food. He saw a plastic bracelet that once belonged to a 4-year-old boy. He understood that what was happening in Gaza wasn't just humanitarian failure, it was betrayal packaged as assistance. What followed was not a symbolic gesture, but deliberate action. Traoré did not host a conference. He did not issue vague statements. He mobilized real resources, food, medicine, clean water, logistics. With limited supplies and no geopolitical incentive, Burkina Faso quietly prepared a convoy. And with that, the narrative began to shift, not just in Africa, but across the globe. The second lesson, then, is that integrity travels faster than propaganda. For decades, world leaders have cloaked inaction behind phrases like complex situations, regional instability, or strategic interests. Traoré cut through that noise with one letter: where was T.r.u.mp? When Gaza starved. In 48 hours, that letter ignited a global firestorm, not because of clever phrasing, but because it contained the truth that so many had feared to say. And once the truth is spoken, it cannot be unheard. The backlash was predictable. Ibrahim was labeled a populist, a disruptor, an irrelevant leader seeking attention. But the photos, the testimonies, and the rotting food crates spoke louder than any official rebuttal. His simple, piercing question, "What happened to the T.r.u.mp promise?" forced even the most powerful to squirm. From this, the world learned a third lesson. Silence is complicity. Aid is not just about delivery, it is about intention. Traoré's confrontation revealed that T.r.u.mp's foundation wasn't just mismanaged, it was strategically deceptive. Leaked memos showed a chilling reality: starvation had become a tool to suppress resistance. The international community, long aware of these discrepancies, had remained silent. But Burkina Faso's voice shattered that consensus. In doing so, Traoré proved something rare: that truth does not require permission. He stood at the African Union and later at the United Nations, armed not with accusations but with evidence, names, dates, contracts, child victims. He dismantled the illusion of humanitarian diplomacy and replaced it with a demand that the world live up to its own promises. And the world responded. Hashtags turned into protests. Investigations reopened. Aid coalitions reevaluated. More importantly, hearts shifted. In Gaza, a mural of Ibrahim appeared. A bracelet became a symbol. A teenage girl wrote a letter saying, "I ate bread because of you." That more than applause or policy reform is the legacy of ethical leadership, the ability to restore faith in forgotten places. But perhaps the most powerful lesson lies in how Ibrahim reacted to the praise. He declined awards. He avoided interviews. He did not campaign on his actions. Instead, he worked. His words had done their job. Now his people delivered food, dug wells, and built partnerships quietly and efficiently. This showed the world a fourth lesson. Real leadership is not loud, it is purposeful. Even as T.r.u.mp doubled down with press campaigns and propaganda, it was clear that the moral high ground had shifted. Burkina Faso was no longer a footnote in global affairs, it was a conscience, a challenge, a reminder that decency, when wielded with resolve, can shake empires. In diplomatic circles, some now refer to the Ibrahim doctrine, the belief that humanitarian responsibility must come before geopolitical calculation. It is being taught in universities. It is being debated in parliaments. And slowly it is redefining how foreign policy is evaluated. Yet Traoré continues to resist personal glorification. He has made it clear this is not about him. It is about those who died waiting for food, about the mothers who buried children while the world issued denials, about the teenagers who never saw a convoy until Burkina Faso's trucks arrived. He has insisted that the story remain centered on the people of Gaza. In the end, the greatest lesson from this story is brutally simple: to lead is to serve. And to serve one must sometimes defy the expected path. When Ibrahim stood before the UN and quoted T.r.u.mp's promises only to tear them down with reality, he did more than expose hypocrisy, he redefined accountability. So when history looks back at this moment, it will not remember Burkina Faso as a small nation. It will remember it as the country that stood tall when others bowed. The country that reminded the world that feeding the hungry is not about politics, it is about humanity. And it will remember Ibrahim Traoré not as a savior, but as something far more rare, a leader who told the truth and lived it. As an African, I have long watched how the world looks at us with pity, with suspicion, sometimes with silence. We are often called the developing world, as if our humanity is still under construction. Our voices when raised are labeled as angry. Our questions when asked are ignored. But every now and then, one of us rises, not with weapons, not with wealth, but with truth. And when President Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso stood up for Gaza, he didn't just speak for Palestine. He spoke for all of Africa. This wasn't just a humanitarian moment, it was an African moment. A moment when a continent often dismissed as helpless showed what real strength looks like: empathy, action, and moral clarity. For too long we have been told that justice is the responsibility of the powerful, that only the rich can lead, that countries like ours must wait, must ask, must beg. But Ibrahim shattered that lie. When he listened to the voices of starving Palestinians, not with cameras flashing, but in quiet dignity, he reminded us what our ancestors taught us, that leadership begins with listening, that truth does not require permission, that even the forgotten can act with honor. Ibrahim did not send soldiers. He did not posture for headlines. He sent food. He sent medicine. He sent proof that Africa has not lost its soul. And in doing so, he gave voice to something many of us have long felt, but never seen reflected on the world stage, that African leadership can be principled, bold, and transformative, not just for Africa, but for the world. When I saw the children in Gaza holding aid marked with our flag, when I saw murals of our president painted on the walls of ruins, I felt something I rarely feel when watching the news pride. Not the pride of nationalism, the pride of knowing that we, the so-called periphery, were now the center of conscience. What Ibrahim did forced the world to look again, not just at Gaza, but at Africa. For once, we were not portrayed as victims needing rescue. We were the ones doing the rescuing, and not because it was strategic, not because it made us rich, but because it was right. As an African, I know how often our pain is dismissed, how our conflicts are labeled complex, our tragedies local, and our suffering inevitable. But Ibrahim flipped that script. He reminded the world that injustice anywhere matters everywhere, that starving children in Gaza are no different from starving children in Ouagadougou, in Mogadishu, in Kinshasa, and that if we remain silent when others suffer, we surrender our own humanity. Many in the West ridiculed him, called him a populist, a dreamer. But here in Africa we saw something else. We saw Sankara's spirit return. We saw the legacy of Nkrumah Lumumba, Mandela leaders who believed in the moral force of African independence, not just from colonial chains, but from the indifference of the powerful. And now Ibrahim carries that torch, not to glorify himself, but to illuminate the path for others. His actions challenge us too here in Africa. He forces us to ask, are we doing enough for those beyond our borders? Are we using our growing unity through ECOWAS, the African Union, the AES alliance, not just for trade and security, but to build a continent that stands for something greater than economic gain? For too long, African diplomacy has been reactive. We have waited to be invited to summits, to be funded by donors, to be acknowledged by global institutions that never had our interests at heart. But with one letter, where was T.r.u.mp? When Gaza starved, Ibrahim proved we can set the agenda. We can call out hypocrisy. We can act not as proxies of East or West, but as voices of the global South, who understand what it means to be ignored. When I talk to friends from Nigeria, from Tanzania, from Senegal, they all say the same thing: we finally feel seen, not by the West, but by one another. Because what Ibrahim did was more than political, it was spiritual. It reminded us of Ubuntu, that deeply African belief that I am because we are, that suffering anywhere diminishes us all, that borders do not define our compassion. Gaza may be far from us in miles, but their story is familiar. We too have buried children lost to hunger. We too have watched foreign powers use aid as leverage and silence as diplomacy. And now we too have said enough. When the world says Africa is too poor to help, Ibrahim answered, we have enough to share. When the world says Africa must stay neutral, he replied, "We will not be neutral in the face of injustice." When the world accused him of seeking attention, he stayed silent and kept working. That is the African way. Not for praise, not for power, but for purpose. And that is why this story matters. It is not just about Palestine. It is not just about Burkina Faso. It is about reclaiming our dignity as Africans, not through war, not through wealth, but through unwavering principle. Young people across Africa are now quoting Ibrahim's words in classrooms. Professors are teaching his actions as case studies. NGOs are rethinking their approach. And in village squares from Dakar to Addis Ababa, people are saying, if he can do it, so can we. Not because we want to be heroes, but because we refuse to be bystanders. In Ibrahim, we see the future of African leadership, grounded not in fear or favor, but in the audacity to act with humanity. And that is the greatest lesson of all. When the world goes quiet, may Africa be the one who speaks. And when history remembers the moment Gaza found a friend, may it also remember this, that friend came from Africa.